72-year-old millionaire surprising will changes his young bride's life forever. The grand estate of Thomas Winthrop, a 72-year-old reclusive millionaire, echoed with an air of mystery that night. As the clock struck midnight, the sprawling dining hall was illuminated by a single, flickering chandelier. Cecilia, his 28-year-old bride, sat in stunned silence, clutching the envelope she had just been handed by the family lawyer. Her heart raced as she glanced at the pale faces of the gathered relatives, all eyes on her. Thomas's final wishes had upended everything, leaving Cecilia at the center of a storm she had never anticipated. Earlier that evening, Thomas had raised a toast to love, loyalty, and legacy, his deep voice resonating with an enigmatic warmth. No one suspected it would be his last. Now, as Cecilia unfolded the crisp, yellowed parchment, the room's air grew heavier. What could Thomas have possibly written that would make the fortune-hungry crowd gasp in unison? The words on the page would not only change Cecilia's life but reveal secrets that threatened to shatter the family's gilded facade forever. Cecilia's life had been an unlikely series of events that brought her to the gilded doors of Thomas Winthrop's estate. A small-town librarian with a penchant for classic novels and modest ambitions, she had never dreamed of stepping into a world of private jets, priceless art, and elaborate galas. But her path crossed with Thomas's at a charity book auction a year ago, where his sharp wit and an almost childlike fascination with her knowledge of literature had caught her off guard. Their whirlwind romance had sparked whispers and raised eyebrows, but Cecilia's genuine warmth seemed to thaw the stoic millionaire's cold exterior. Thomas Winthrop, a man of great wealth but a guarded heart, had built an empire from nothing. Born into poverty, he had clawed his way to the top with sheer determination and an almost ruthless pragmatism. His late wife, Margaret, had been the only one to see the softer side of him, and her untimely death had left him a shadow of his former self for over a decade. Friends and family noted how Cecilia's presence had reignited a spark in him. Yet, to Thomas's estranged relatives, her arrival was a threat, a symbol of their dwindling grip on his affections and fortune. Despite their lavish lifestyle, Cecilia had often felt out of place in the sprawling halls of the Winthrop estate. The grandeur, though breathtaking, was suffocating at times, and the ever-watchful eyes of Thomas's family made her uneasy. His niece, Victoria, and nephew, Edward, were particularly vocal in their disdain, thinly veiling their contempt with polite but icy remarks. The staff, loyal to Thomas but wary of his new bride, treated her with a mix of respect and caution. In the months leading up to his death, Thomas had been working tirelessly on a secretive project, spending late nights in his study. He had grown unusually reflective, often speaking cryptically about legacy and unfinished business. Cecilia had assumed these were the musings of an aging man considering his mortality. She had no idea that Thomas's final act would not only expose long-buried truths but place her in the middle of a family war where loyalties, greed, and love would collide. The night of Thomas Winthrop's passing began like any other. A grand dinner was held in the dining hall, its high ceilings adorned with glistening chandeliers, and the air filled with the faint scent of fresh lilies. Thomas, in his usual commanding yet amiable manner, toasted to the beauty of second chances, his eyes lingering on Cecilia as he spoke. The words earned a few awkward chuckles from his relatives, who, despite their perfectly tailored appearances, could not mask their disdain for the young bride. Cecilia had spent the evening trying to navigate the tense undercurrents at the table. Victoria and Edward, seated directly across from her, exchanged knowing smirks as they whispered to one another, their glances at her laden with condescension. Thomas, ever the composed patriarch, seemed unfazed by their antics, leaning towards Cecilia occasionally to whisper a witty remark or reassure her with a gentle squeeze of her hand. As the evening wore on, Thomas appeared more reflective than usual. He excused himself early, retreating to his private study. Cecilia followed shortly after, intending to say goodnight. When she entered the dimly lit room, she found him sitting at his ornate mahogany desk, an envelope in his hand. He smiled at her, his eyes betraying a flicker of weariness. "Cecilia," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it, you have brought more light into my life than I ever thought possible. Promise me that no matter what happens, you will trust yourself to stand strong." The peculiar words unsettled her, but before she could press him, he handed her the envelope. "Give this to Mr. Harrington when the time comes," he added, referring to the family lawyer. Before she could respond, he kissed her forehead and gently ushered her out of the study. The next morning, Thomas Winthrop was found unresponsive in his bed. The news swept through the estate like wildfire, igniting shock and speculation. The family, cloaked in a thin veneer of mourning, quickly turned their attention to the matter of his will. Mr. Harrington arrived that afternoon, a thick briefcase in hand and an air of solemn professionalism. The family gathered in the drawing room, the tension palpable. As Harrington began reading the will, Cecilia clutched the envelope Thomas had given her, her palms clammy. The reading proceeded as expected, with the distribution of properties and financial assets causing murmurs of satisfaction or subtle resentment among the relatives. But then Harrington paused, clearing his throat. "There is one final matter," he announced, lifting the envelope from Cecilia's trembling hands. He opened it carefully and began to read aloud, his voice steady yet tinged with gravity. As the contents were revealed, gasps filled the room, followed by a stunned silence. Thomas's final wishes were unlike anything anyone could have predicted. In an instant, the entire foundation of the Winthrop family's expectations crumbled, leaving Cecilia as the unexpected key to his enigmatic legacy. The room erupted into chaos, the family's long-hidden animosities laid bare. And Cecilia, the quiet outsider, now found herself thrust into a battle she never sought but could no longer avoid. The room erupted into chaos as Mr. Harrington's voice faded into the shocked murmurs of the gathered family. The lawyer had barely finished reading Thomas Winthrop's unexpected directive when Victoria's sharp voice sliced through the tension. "This is preposterous. How could he entrust the estate, everything, to her?" she snapped, her manicured fingers trembling as she pointed at Cecilia. Edward, seated beside her, leaned back in his chair, his face flushed with anger. "You must have manipulated him," he accused, his tone dripping with contempt. "He'd never willingly hand over his life's work to someone who wasn't family." Cecilia's heart pounded as she clutched the armrest of her chair. All eyes were on her now, a mix of disbelief, suspicion, and hostility. She had known that marrying Thomas, a man so far removed from her world, would invite scrutiny, but this was beyond anything she had anticipated. Harrington raised a hand, his expression stern. "Please, everyone." The late Mr. Winthrop's wishes were clear and legally binding. Mrs. Cecilia Winthrop is to act as executor of the estate, with full authority over all assets. Victoria rose to her feet, her voice shrill. "Then we can test it. This isn't over." Cecilia, though trembling inside, straightened her posture and met Victoria's glare. "I didn't ask for this," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging in her chest. "But Thomas trusted me to honor his wishes, and I intend to do so." Her declaration only fueled the family's resentment. Victoria stormed out, followed closely by Edward and a few other relatives, leaving Cecilia alone with Harrington. The lawyer leaned toward her, his voice softening. "Mrs. Winthrop, I'll assist you in navigating this, but you should prepare for resistance. Thomas's decision, it's bound to uncover long-held grievances." That evening, Cecilia sat in Thomas's study, the envelope's contents spread across the desk. Among the papers was a handwritten letter addressed to her. "My dearest Cecilia, if you're reading this, I am no longer with you. Please know that loving you brought joy back into my life. I chose you to oversee my estate not just because I trusted you, but because I believed in your ability to protect what truly matters. The Winthrop name is weighed down by secrets, and the legacy I leave behind is more complicated than it seems. Trust your instincts, and remember, the truth must come to light. Yours always, Thomas." Cecilia's hands shook as she folded the letter. What secrets could Thomas have been referring to? She thought back to the locked drawer in his desk, the one he had forbidden her from opening. With newfound resolve, she retrieved the key from a hidden compartment in his desk and unlocked it. Inside, she found a thick folder labeled Legacy. The folder contained documents, photos, and old newspaper clippings. One headline caught her eye: "Local family bankrupt after Winthrop acquisition." Another article detailed a workers' protest at one of his factories decades ago, ending in tragedy. Alongside these were personal letters written to Thomas, pleas for help, accusations, and veiled threats. It was clear that Thomas's empire had been built not only on brilliance but also on ruthless decisions that had left a trail of broken lives. As Cecilia read, the pieces began to fall into place. Thomas's guilt over these actions must have haunted him, driving his desire to rectify the past. But what was she supposed to do with this information? Could she risk tarnishing his name to fulfill his final wish? The following weeks were a whirlwind of challenges. Victoria and Edward wasted no time filing a formal contest against the will. They hired a high-powered attorney who began digging into Cecilia's past, looking for any flaw to discredit her. The media caught wind of the drama, painting Cecilia as either a gold-digging opportunist or a tragic figure caught in a family feud. Paparazzi camped outside the estate, their cameras flashing whenever she ventured beyond the gates. Cecilia's only solace was in the quiet moments she spent piecing together the puzzle Thomas had left her. She reached out to the people mentioned in the articles and letters, listening to their stories of betrayal and loss. Some were angry and skeptical, unwilling to believe she had good intentions. Others, however, saw her sincerity and began to share valuable information. Her most surprising ally came in the form of Daniel Harper, a former factory worker whose father had died during the protest. Initially cold and suspicious, Daniel agreed to meet with Cecilia after she persistently reached out. Over coffee in a small diner, he told her the story of how Thomas's company had crushed their union efforts, leaving countless families in poverty. "My father believed in justice," Daniel said, his voice heavy with emotion. "He believed that one day someone would make things right. I never thought that person would be his widow." Cecilia's heart ached as she listened, but his words solidified her resolve. "I can't change what happened," she said. "But I can't ignore it either. If Thomas wanted me to make amends, then that's what I'll do." As Cecilia's investigation progressed, she uncovered more troubling details. Victoria and Edward, it seemed, had been quietly siphoning funds from the family trust for years. Their luxurious lifestyles were funded by money meant for charitable endeavors Thomas had established. When Cecilia confronted them during a heated family meeting, Victoria's mask of composure slipped. "Don't you dare lecture me about integrity." Victoria spat, her voice venomous. "You don't belong here. You never did. Thomas made a mistake bringing you into this family." Cecilia stood her ground. "Thomas believed in me, and I won't let him down. The truth will come out, whether you like it or not." Determined to protect Thomas's legacy while honoring the truth, Cecilia began drafting a plan. She worked with Harrington to create a foundation dedicated to supporting the communities Thomas's empire had impacted. She also initiated an independent audit of the family trust, much to Victoria and Edward's fury. The more Cecilia fought, the clearer it became that this battle was about more than money or property. It was about redemption, not just for Thomas, but for everyone he had wronged. As the tension escalated, Cecilia realized she was no longer the timid librarian who had once felt out of place in Thomas's world. She was stronger now, and she was ready to face whatever came next. The Winthrop estate buzzed with tension as the long-awaited family meeting convened in the grand hall. Cecilia stood at the head of the table, her hands resting firmly on the folder she had spent weeks compiling. The once overwhelming grandeur of the room no longer intimidated her. She was here to confront the family, not as an outsider, but as the woman Thomas had entrusted with his legacy. Victoria and Edward sat across from her, their faces masks of smugness. Edward leaned back in his chair, feigning indifference, while Victoria's sharp gaze cut through the air. Around them, other family members whispered, unsure which side to support. Mr. Harrington, seated beside Cecilia, cleared his throat, commanding attention. "Thank you all for attending," Harrington began. "Mrs. Winthrop has requested this meeting to address matters of the estate and share her findings regarding Mr. Thomas Winthrop's legacy." Cecilia took a deep breath and opened the folder, her voice steady as she began. "Thomas left me with a responsibility, one I have not taken lightly. Over the past few weeks, I've uncovered truths about this family and the empire he built." She paused, meeting the eyes of each person in the room. "These truths demand accountability." Victoria scoffed, crossing her arms. "More theatrics. Let's get this over with, shall we?" Ignoring the jab, Cecilia slid a series of documents across the table. "These are records of misappropriated funds from the family trust," she stated. "Funds intended for charity, which were instead diverted to personal accounts." Her eyes locked on Victoria and Edward. "The evidence points directly to both of you." The room erupted into murmurs. Edward's face turned crimson as he stammered, "This is ridiculous. You can't prove anything." "I can," Cecilia countered, her voice unyielding. She pulled out bank statements and highlighted transactions. "These were traced to offshore accounts linked to your names. This is a fraud, plain and simple." Victoria's composure cracked. "You think you can waltz in here and dismantle everything? Thomas was blind to your manipulative nature, but we're not." "Thomas trusted me because he knew I would do what's right," Cecilia retorted. "This family's wealth was built on more than business acumen. It was built on exploitation and secrets that he could no longer live with. If you're so concerned about legacy, then it's time to face the truth." Harrington interjected, his tone calm but firm. "The evidence Mrs. Winthrop has provided is sufficient to warrant an independent investigation. If pursued, the consequences could be severe." The weight of his words silenced the room. Victoria and Edward exchanged nervous glances, their bravado wavering. But Cecilia wasn't finished. She stood taller, her voice resolute. "Thomas wanted this family to do better. That's why I've established the Winthrop Foundation, a new organization focused on supporting the communities that suffered due to past decisions. All funds from the estate will be funneled into this foundation, ensuring transparency and integrity moving forward." Gasps rippled through the room. "You can't do that!" Edward exclaimed, slamming his fist on the table. "I can," Cecilia replied. "And I have." The meeting reached its boiling point as Victoria and Edward attempted to rally the remaining family members against her. But the tide was turning. Some relatives, tired of the secrecy and greed, spoke up in support of Cecilia's actions. They saw her as the change Thomas had envisioned, a beacon of hope in a family tarnished by its ambitions. As the meeting adjourned, Victoria and Edward stormed out, their threats echoing in the hall. But Cecilia remained composed, her resolve unshaken. Harrington approached her with a rare smile. "You handled that brilliantly, Mrs. Winthrop." Cecilia exhaled, the weight of the confrontation finally lifting. "Thomas believed in redemption," she said softly. "I hope I've honored that." At that moment, Cecilia realized she had done more than protect Thomas's legacy. She had forged her own, one built on courage, integrity, and the determination to right the wrongs of the past. In the weeks following the tumultuous family meeting, a new sense of purpose enveloped the Winthrop estate. The once stifling halls now felt alive with activity, as Cecilia spearheaded the formation of the Winthrop Foundation. Her days were filled with meetings, planning sessions, and visits to the communities Thomas had harmed, determined to make amends. Though the weight of her responsibilities was immense, she felt a newfound clarity that gave her strength. The backlash from Victoria and Edward had been swift but ultimately futile. Their threats to contest the will fizzled as the mountain of evidence against them grew. Faced with the possibility of legal action, they quietly retreated from public life, their influence in the family irrevocably diminished. Meanwhile, other relatives, inspired by Cecilia's resolve, began to rally around her efforts. They pledged their support to the foundation, eager to redefine the Winthrop legacy. One crisp autumn morning, Cecilia stood in a garden overlooking the sprawling estate. The golden sunlight filtered through the trees, casting a warm glow over the grounds. Daniel Harper approached, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. Since their initial meeting, he had become a close advisor and confidant, helping Cecilia navigate the complexities of addressing the past. "It's looking beautiful out here," Daniel remarked, his gaze sweeping over the landscape. Cecilia smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. "It's amazing how much changes when you stop running from the truth. For the first time, I feel like I'm honoring Thomas the way he would have wanted." Daniel nodded. "You've done more than honor him. You've set a standard for what redemption looks like." As they walked, Cecilia shared her plans for the foundation's first initiative, rebuilding the community center in the town where Thomas's factories had once stood. The project would include job training programs, educational workshops, and support for small businesses. She had already begun reaching out to local leaders to ensure the community's voice guided every step of the process. "It's not just about repairing the damage," Cecilia explained. "It's about creating opportunities that didn't exist before. We can't erase the past, but we can shape a better future." Later that evening, Cecilia returned to the study, now transformed into her workspace. The once intimidating room, with its heavy furniture and shelves of unread books, had become a sanctuary. On the desk sat a framed photo of her and Thomas from their wedding day, a reminder of the man who had believed in her when no one else did. As she sifted through documents, a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Harrington, his ever-professional demeanor softened by a rare smile. "I wanted to personally deliver this," he said, handing her an envelope. Inside was the official approval for the Winthrop Foundation's nonprofit status, a milestone Cecilia had worked tirelessly to achieve. Her smile widened as she held the document. "Thank you, Mr. Harrington. I couldn't have done this without your guidance." He inclined his head. "The credit is yours, Mrs. Winthrop. You've turned what could have been a disaster into something remarkable. Thomas would be proud." Cecilia spent the remainder of the evening writing letters to the individuals who had shared their stories with her during her investigation. She thanked them for their courage and promised that the foundation would work to honor their struggles. Each letter felt like a step toward fulfilling Thomas's final wish. The grand unveiling of the Winthrop Foundation took place a month later at a modest community hall in the heart of the town most affected by Thomas's business practices. The event was attended by residents, community leaders, and a few supportive family members. Cecilia stood at the podium, her heart racing as she faced the crowd. "When Thomas entrusted me with his legacy," she began, "I didn't fully understand what that meant. But through your stories and your resilience, I've come to see the truth. A legacy isn't about wealth or power. It's about the impact we leave behind." She paused, her voice steady as she continued. "This foundation is a promise to do better, to listen, and to act with integrity. Together, we can turn a legacy of pain into one of hope." The room erupted in applause, and as Cecilia stepped down from the podium, she was greeted with handshakes, hugs, and words of gratitude. For the first time, she felt truly connected to the world Thomas had left behind. As the evening wound down, Daniel approached her, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You did it," he said simply. "We did it," Cecilia corrected, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "This is just the beginning." In the months and years that followed, the Winthrop Foundation became a symbol of redemption and progress. Cecilia's work transformed not only the lives of those the foundation served but also the fractured Winthrop family. Slowly, they began to rebuild trust, inspired by her unwavering commitment to Thomas's vision. And as Cecilia walked through the bustling foundation offices one sunny afternoon, she glanced at a plaque on the wall. It bore Thomas's favorite words, "Legacy is not what we leave behind, but what we build together." At that moment, Cecilia knew she had not only fulfilled his wishes but had also carved out a legacy of her own, one built on truth, resilience, and the power of second chances.